Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a certified military pilot on board, please notify a flight attendant immediately. The captain's voice came through the cabin speakers with a calm tone that somehow made the sudden silence inside the aircraft feel even heavier. Just seconds earlier, the plane had been cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet above a blanket of clouds somewhere over the Midwest, the soft hum of the engines blending with the quiet rustle of magazines and the occasional clink of ice in plastic cups. Now the seatbelt sign glowed bright amber above every row, and a subtle but unmistakable tremor ran through the fuselage, like the aircraft itself had taken a long, uneasy breath. A few passengers lifted their heads. Others exchanged confused looks. One woman paused mid-sip of coffee, her hand hovering in the air as if she were waiting for the captain to finish the sentence. But no explanation followed, only the low mechanical drone of the engines and the distant whisper of wind against the wings. Near the front of the cabin, a flight attendant moved down the aisle with controlled urgency, her polite smile replaced by the focused expression of someone following a checklist she had practiced many times but hoped never to use. Row after row of passengers looked up as she passed, curiosity slowly turning into concern. A man in a business suit leaned toward his neighbor and murmured something under his breath. Across the aisle, a college student pulled out one earbud, then the other, trying to catch the next announcement. But in seat 8A, none of that seemed to matter. Marcus Reed was asleep. His head rested lightly against the window, the pale afternoon sunlight filtering through the oval glass and touching the side of his face. The quiet rhythm of the engines had lulled him into a deep, steady sleep, the kind that only came after long nights and longer weeks. Beside him, curled against the armrest with a small stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, his 7-year-old daughter Lily shifted slightly but did not wake. Her sneakers barely touched the floor, and her dark curls rested against the sleeve of Marcus's worn gray hoodie. To anyone passing by, they looked like what they were: a tired father and his little girl catching a peaceful moment in the middle of a long flight. 2 rows. Behind them, a tall man with a pressed white shirt leaned forward, glancing toward Marcus with a puzzled frown before whispering to the person beside him, his voice low but edged with impatience. "If something's wrong up there," he muttered, "you'd think someone qualified would stand up by now." Up front, the flight attendant paused near the galley and lifted the intercom handset again. A faint vibration passed through the cabin floor, subtle but enough for a few passengers to grip their armrests a little tighter. Then the captain's voice returned, still steady, but now carrying a note that made every conversation stop mid-sentence. "Again, if there are any trained combat pilots on board this aircraft, please identify yourselves to the nearest crew member immediately." The words seemed to hang in the air, drifting slowly through the cabin like a question no one wanted to answer. For a long moment, nobody moved. And in seat 8A, Marcus Reed kept sleeping, unaware that within the next few minutes every eye on the plane would turn toward him. For several long seconds after the announcement, nothing happened. The quiet inside the cabin stretched thin, like a room waiting for someone to clear their throat first. A few passengers shifted in their seats, glancing up and down the aisle, as if a uniformed pilot might suddenly stand up from economy class and confidently walk forward. But nobody moved. The only sounds were the low vibration of the engines and the faint rattle of a plastic cup rolling slightly across a tray table as the aircraft adjusted its heading. The flight attendant who had been moving down the aisle slowed near row 10 and looked around carefully, her eyes scanning each face with a professional calm that hid the urgency behind the captain's request. Most passengers avoided eye contact. A middle-aged man in a navy blazer shook his head before she could even ask. A young traveler with a laptop lifted both hands slightly, as if to say that he definitely was not the person they were looking for. The attendant nodded politely and continued walking forward. In seat 8A, Marcus Reed shifted slightly in his sleep, the motion small enough that only the sunlight flickering across the window seemed to notice. His shoulders rose and fell slowly, steady and peaceful, as if the world outside the aircraft did not exist. Months of long workdays and restless nights had built up a quiet exhaustion inside him, the kind that settles deep in the bones. The soft drone of the engines had carried him away into the kind of sleep he rarely allowed himself. Beside him, Lily Reed stirred and blinked her eyes open. For a moment, she looked confused, like a child waking in a place that felt both familiar and strange. She rubbed her eyes with the back of her small hand and glanced around the cabin. The seatbelt sign glowing above them caught her attention first, followed by the tense silence that had replaced the easy chatter from earlier in the flight. She turned toward her father and gently tugged on the sleeve of his hoodie. "Dad?" she whispered softly, careful not to wake the entire row. Marcus did not respond right away. His head remained tilted against the window, his breathing deep and even. Lily leaned a little closer and nudged him again, this time with the quiet persistence that only a child can manage. "Dad," they said something on the speaker. Across the aisle, a passenger leaned forward and looked toward Marcus with a skeptical glance before turning back to his companion. "You would think someone trained would already be up there," the man muttered under his breath. A few rows ahead, another flight attendant moved quickly toward the front of the aircraft, disappearing behind the curtain that separated the cabin from the cockpit corridor. The tension in the air continued to grow, subtle but unmistakable, like the moments before a thunderstorm when the sky turns heavy and still. Lily tugged gently on Marcus's sleeve one more time. This time his eyes opened slowly. At first his expression carried the distant calm of someone waking from deep sleep, but that calm shifted the moment he noticed the unusual silence around him. His gaze moved across the cabin, reading the small details that most people missed. The glowing seatbelt sign, the worried faces, the flight attendant speaking quietly into the intercom near the front. Then the captain's voice returned once more over the speakers, measured but firm. "This is the captain speaking again. If there are any trained combat pilots on board, please identify yourself immediately." Marcus blinked once, fully awake now, and Lily looked up at him with wide, curious eyes as the quiet question hanging over the entire aircraft slowly reached seat 8A. Lily watched her father carefully as the meaning of the captain's words settled across the cabin like a slow-moving shadow. Marcus Reed sat still for a moment, his eyes focused somewhere ahead but not quite on anything in particular, as if he were listening to a distant sound that nobody else could hear. The engines hummed steadily beneath the floor of the aircraft, a familiar vibration that most passengers barely noticed. But Marcus noticed it. He noticed the slight variation in pitch, the subtle shift in rhythm that told him something about the aircraft was not quite operating the way it should. Years ago, those sounds had been part of his everyday world, signals and patterns that his mind had learned to read the way other people read street signs. Lily tugged gently on his sleeve again. "Dad, the captain said they need a pilot," she whispered, her voice soft but curious. Marcus looked down at her and offered a small, reassuring smile. It was the kind of smile he used whenever she was worried about something she did not understand yet. Around them, the quiet tension inside the cabin continued to grow. A man across the aisle leaned forward slightly, studying Marcus for a moment before glancing away again. 2 rows behind them, the tall passenger in the pressed white shirt shifted impatiently in his seat. "If this plane really needs a pilot," he said quietly to the woman beside him, "you would think someone qualified would step up." The woman shrugged nervously and looked toward the front of the aircraft where another flight attendant was speaking quickly into a phone mounted near the galley. Marcus turned his attention back toward the window. Outside, the sky stretched wide and pale above a sea of clouds glowing softly in the afternoon sunlight. 35,000 feet above the ground, everything looked peaceful. But inside the cockpit, something had clearly changed. The announcement had not sounded like a routine request. It carried a tone that Marcus recognized instantly. Controlled urgency. The kind that pilots used when they did not want to alarm passengers, but needed help immediately. Lily tilted her head slightly. "Dad?" she said again. "You used to fly airplanes, right?" Marcus paused. The question was simple, but it reached deeper than she realized. For a moment, memories flickered across his mind like old photographs. Long runways stretching into desert air. The quiet glow of cockpit panels before sunrise. The steady voice of air traffic control in his headset guiding him through miles of open sky. It had been years since those days. A different life. A different chapter. Marcus exhaled slowly and nodded once. "A long time ago," he said gently. Lily's eyes brightened with quiet excitement. To her, the idea that her father had once flown airplanes still sounded like something out of a storybook. But before she could say anything else, the captain's voice returned once more over the cabin speakers, steady but unmistakably serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are dealing with an unexpected flight control issue. If there is a trained combat pilot on board, please come forward immediately." This time the words moved through the cabin like a ripple across water. Heads turned. Conversations stopped completely. Every passenger understood now that the request was not simply precautionary. Marcus Reed slowly unfastened his seatbelt and sat up straighter, the soft click of the buckle barely audible beneath the steady hum of the engines as Lily watched him with wide, curious eyes. The small click of Marcus Reed's seatbelt releasing sounded almost insignificant against the steady hum of the aircraft, yet Lily noticed it immediately. She looked up at her father, her eyes wide with curiosity as he leaned forward slightly and rested his hands on the armrests. Around them, the quiet tension in the cabin had thickened. Passengers were no longer pretending everything was normal. Conversations had stopped completely, replaced by the uneasy silence that follows an announcement nobody fully understands, but everyone feels. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer watched Marcus for a moment, his eyebrows drawing together as if he were trying to figure something out. 2 rows behind them, the tall passenger in the white shirt leaned forward again, his voice low but sharp enough to carry. "Finally, someone is moving," he murmured, though his tone suggested more skepticism than relief. Marcus did not look back. Instead, he turned toward Lily and gently brushed a curl away from her face. His voice was calm and warm, the same steady tone he used whenever he wanted her to feel safe no matter what was happening around them. "Stay right here for a minute, kiddo," he said quietly. "I am just going to talk to the crew." Lily nodded slowly, though her eyes followed him with the kind of trust only a child gives a parent. To her, the moment felt important even if she did not fully understand why. Marcus stood up, the movement drawing the attention of several nearby passengers who had been watching the aisle ever since the captain's announcement. He stretched slightly, as if waking his body after a long nap, and glanced toward the front of the aircraft where the flight attendants were gathered near the curtain leading to the cockpit corridor. The aisle seemed longer now than it had earlier in the flight, every step carrying the quiet weight of dozens of eyes following him. As Marcus walked forward, the flight attendant near row 6 noticed him approaching and offered a polite but cautious smile, closed softly behind Marcus Reed, sealing off the tense murmur of the passenger cabin and replacing it with a completely different world of blinking lights, glowing screens, and focused urgency. The smell of electronics and recycled air filled the small space, and the steady vibration of the aircraft felt stronger here, traveling through the metal floor beneath his feet. The captain sat forward in his seat, both hands resting on the control column as he glanced quickly over his shoulder. His co-pilot was leaning slightly to one side, still conscious but clearly struggling to focus on the instruments in front of him. The aircraft continued moving steadily through the high-altitude sky, but the tension inside the cockpit was unmistakable. The captain studied Marcus carefully, his eyes measuring the calm expression on the man standing behind the seats. "You said you flew combat aircraft," he said, his voice controlled but direct. Marcus nodded once. "United States Air Force. 8 years. Mostly night operations and high-altitude transport escort." The captain absorbed the information quickly, the way experienced pilots process details under pressure. Outside the windshield, the sky stretched endlessly, pale blue fading into thin clouds that drifted beneath the aircraft like a quiet ocean. Technical details, but fully aware that something serious was unfolding. The captain glanced sideways at Marcus again. "When was the last time you flew?" he asked. Marcus paused for a moment before answering. "About 4 years ago," he said calmly. The captain considered that for a brief second, then gave a short nod. Experience like that did not disappear completely, even after years away from the cockpit. "All right," the captain said, adjusting his headset. "Let us see if your instincts are still sharp." Marcus reached forward slightly, resting his hands near the edge of the instrument panel without touching anything yet, listening carefully to the subtle language of the aircraft through the vibrations beneath his seat and the steady whisper of air rushing past the fuselage at nearly 500 miles per hour high above the quiet world below. Marcus Reed did not reach for the controls right away. Instead, he listened. The steady hum of the engines vibrated through the cockpit floor while the aircraft cut through the thin upper atmosphere at 35,000 feet. Outside the wide cockpit windshield, the sky was calm, endless, and almost deceptively peaceful. That is exactly what we are seeing. For a moment the cockpit was silent except for the constant whisper of air moving over the aircraft at high altitude. Marcus rested his hands lightly on his knees, thinking. The memories were returning now, not as distant flashes, but as something closer to muscle memory. Years earlier he had spent thousands of hours inside cockpits just like this one, navigating complex systems while flying missions through dark skies where every second mattered. The system tried to correct itself. The captain exhaled slowly and flipped the autopilot switch. A soft tone sounded through the cockpit as the automated system disengaged the horizon line for another moment before speaking again. The aircraft is stable, he said calmly. But we should start planning the descent early. Less altitude means less time for the lag to create bigger corrections. The captain nodded slowly, already reaching for the radio. 35,000 feet above the quiet world below, the next phase of the flight had begun. The captain's voice moved calmly through the radio headset as he spoke with air traffic control, his words measured and precise, while the aircraft continued forward through the bright afternoon sky. We are requesting priority descent due to flight control irregularities, he said steadily. A brief pause followed, filled only by the quiet static of the radio channel and the steady airflow rushing across the aircraft's fuselage at nearly 500 miles per hour. Then the controller's voice returned through the speakers. Flight 312, you are cleared to descend to 24,000 feet. Maintain manual control and advise if conditions change. The captain acknowledged the instruction and gently eased the control column forward. The aircraft responded slowly but smoothly, beginning a controlled descent through the open sky. Marcus Reed watched the instruments closely, his attention moving between altitude, airspeed, and the artificial horizon. Every movement of the aircraft was small, deliberate, and carefully timed. The earlier lag in the system still existed, but now the adjustments were predictable enough to manage. Nice and steady, Marcus said quietly. Let the nose settle before the next trim. The captain followed the suggestion, adjusting the trim wheel slightly. The aircraft responded with a gradual shift, easing into a smooth downward glide. Outside the windshield, the bright white clouds that had once seemed far below were slowly rising toward them as the aircraft descended from 35,000 feet toward lower altitude airspace. The co-pilot monitored the flight systems carefully, reading out instrument changes in a calm voice that carried the rhythm of professional training. Airspeed stable. Engine output normal. Descent rate 1,000 feet per minute. The cockpit remained focused and controlled, every movement guided by careful communication. Behind the closed cockpit door, the passengers could feel the subtle change in the aircraft's motion. The gentle shift of gravity as the plane angled downward made a few heads lift toward the windows. Some passengers tightened their seatbelts. Others exchanged nervous looks. In seat 8, a Lily Reed pressed her face lightly against the window, watching the distant clouds move closer beneath the wings. She did not understand the technical details of what was happening, but she sensed that the aircraft was moving with new purpose. The man in the white shirt who had doubted Marcus earlier now sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the cabin ceiling as if listening for answers in the steady hum of the engines. Back inside the cockpit, the aircraft continued descending smoothly through 28,000 feet. Marcus watched the control response carefully, his instincts measuring the delay between input and movement. The lag is improving slightly, he observed. The captain nodded. Denser air is helping stabilize the response. Marcus allowed himself a small breath of relief. The worst uncertainty was beginning to pass. The aircraft was still traveling quickly through the sky, but now it felt balanced again, like a vehicle returning to familiar roads after a difficult stretch of terrain. Air traffic control returned on the radio once more. Flight 312, you are cleared to continue descent to 12,000 feet. Expect approach clearance shortly. The captain acknowledged the instruction and glanced toward Marcus. Looks like we are bringing everyone home the careful way, he said. Marcus watched the horizon one more time before nodding calmly. That is the only way that matters. High above the earth, the aircraft continued its steady descent toward the airport waiting far below, carrying hundreds of passengers who would soon realize that the quiet man from seat 8A had helped guide them safely through the sky. The aircraft continued descending through 12,000 feet with the steady patience of a machine returning home after a long journey through the open sky. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere had changed. The earlier tension had softened into quiet concentration, the kind that pilots know well during the final phase of a difficult flight. Marcus Reed sat forward in the jump seat, his eyes still moving across the instruments while the captain guided the aircraft carefully through the thicker air below. Outside the windshield, the distant landscape was finally visible now, a wide patchwork of rivers, roads, and small towns stretching across the earth beneath the afternoon sunlight. The airport runway appeared ahead in the distance, a narrow gray line resting quietly in the center of the landscape. Air traffic control spoke calmly through the radio. Flight 312, you are cleared for final approach. Wind 3 miles per hour from the west. Runway 27 is clear. The captain acknowledged the instruction and adjusted the aircraft's heading slightly. The control column responded smoothly, the earlier delay almost gone now that the aircraft had reached lower altitude. Marcus watched the horizon carefully. You are lined up well, he said quietly. The captain nodded once, his hands steady on the controls. I have flown thousands of landings, he said with a small smile. But this one will be remembered. The aircraft descended gradually, the runway growing larger through the cockpit window with every passing second. The engines softened to a lower hum as the captain reduced power, allowing the plane to glide the final distance through the calm afternoon air. Moments later, the wheels touched the runway with a gentle rolling contact, followed by the smooth sound of tires meeting pavement. The aircraft slowed steadily along the runway until it finally turned onto the taxiway and came to a controlled stop. Inside the passenger cabin, a wave of quiet relief moved through the rows. Some passengers released long breaths they had not realized they were holding. Others exchanged grateful smiles. In seat 8, a Lily Reed looked toward the front of the aircraft, her stuffed rabbit still tucked against her chest. A few moments later, the cockpit door opened and Marcus stepped back into the cabin. The flight attendants looked at him with new respect, and several passengers quietly began to clap, the sound growing gradually as more people realized who had helped guide the aircraft safely down. The tall man in the white shirt who had doubted him earlier lowered his eyes slightly, saying nothing. Marcus simply walked back to his seat with the calm humility he had carried all along. Lily looked up at him with wide admiration. Dad, she whispered softly, you helped them fly the plane. Marcus fastened his seatbelt again and gave her a gentle smile. The captain did the flying, he said quietly. Lily shook her head with the certainty of a child who knew the truth. Outside the window, the runway stretched into the distance beneath the warm afternoon sun, and the aircraft that had once carried quiet tension now rested peacefully on the ground, its passengers safe because a man who had once flown high above the clouds had simply chosen to stand up when the moment asked for it.